You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You are now entering the Pseudo-Archaeology Podcast, a show that uncovers what's fact, what's fake, and what's fun in the crazy world of pseudo-archaeology. Hello and welcome to the Pseudo-Archaeology Podcast, episode 131. I am your host, Dr. Andrew Kinkella, and tonight, Kon-Tiki. Can you sail a balsa wood boat across the Pacific Ocean in the wrong direction? We shall see. All right, so today's little story / adventure, the Kon-Tiki, is done by student request. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, Kinkella, man, why do you interact with your students? What's wrong with you? You know, they're dirty. Don't do that. Don't dirty yourself with your own students. Just have your own ideas, man. And I'm like, no. I will steal their ideas and then put my name on them. See? Genius move? I think so. So their name will not be said here. So aren't we all happy and excited that I, the great Andrew Kinkella, came up with this idea? I know. You're welcome, world. So, you know, when my student and I were talking about this, it's funny. They had asked me about hey, Kinkella, what about the Kon-Tiki? I'm like, oh my God, what a great idea. And what I will say is I do have this long list that I keep for ideas for this show, you know, just this big, it's like this big, like sheet of lined paper that just has like this big old list of ideas on it. And hopefully nobody will ever find it and see it because it's all scribbly and weird. And you'll be like, was this written by a crazy person? Yeah. And I can't remember if I had it on there or not, but it is an idea that I've had sort of in the back of my mind. And I'll tell you why. And again, in seriousness, I'm so thankful for my student for sort of jogging all the cobwebs in my brain and like, hey, man, the Kon-Tiki, what a great story. This is why I wanted to do this story. It's because I have a little hook where I can tell my own little mini story that goes with it. And actually, I think you are here, dear listener, for the earliest Kinkella story so far. I thought I couldn't beat some of my earlier stories. I said some stuff in earlier podcasts that happened when I was like 12. This one, I think, is from when I was like 7. I was really young, and I think that puts it in the 1970s, just barely. Let me take you back to 1979, when a young first grader reads some sort of first grader easy read book, complete with headphones that you put on and a tape that you put in the tape player, about Thor Heyerdahl and his voyage on the Kon-Tiki. Now, I thought this was just the coolest thing when I was like in the first grade, right? And I just remember little flashes of this story because usually you'd get some crappy story just about, you know, somebody who has a dog or something. But this one was like a voyage with a boat across the Pacific. And I just thought it was so fascinating in my little like first grade mind. And I do remember this, that I was super freaked out by the last name Heyerdahl. I was like, oh my God, I have no idea how to say that. I have no idea what that is. I remember having anxiety about like, I'm not going to be able to say this word. We're going to have like a test on it or something, and I won't know. But man, I thought it was super cool. So, you know, what hooked it for me? Now, those of you who are old enough to remember, and I'm sure there's like 2 of you out there still living, you know, the rest of us are long dead. Not only was this sort of one of those easy read books, or, you know, one that may have even included a cassette tape that you put in that sort of reads along with you. I think there may have also been some sort of book on the Scholastic Books page for any of us in California in like I think probably the 70s and the 80s. Every so often you would get this like sheet that was like maybe 4 pages long, printed on kind of newspapery cheap paper. And it was like the Scholastic Books. It would come like maybe once every 2 or 3 months. And you could try and get your parents to buy you a book or two. They were very inexpensive. And you could go through the whole motions of like Xing the box of the book you wanted and trying to add all the money together and stuff, you know, and buy a book for yourself. And I believe there might have been some obviously super abridged version of Kon-Tiki on there as well. I do remember that usually I just bought like Star Wars books all the time. Right. That was my main go-to. I bought every Star Wars movie, but abridged for a second grader to read book. Like I bought all. I was and still am a Star Wars fanatic. But in that world, it's a testament to Kon-Tiki that it would get me to not get a Star Wars thing right that month in my, 7-year-old brain and get this other thing as well. So it just really lit that fire in me of exploration. I do think it was the first thing that really did. Now, yes, Luke Skywalker staring at the twin suns of Tatooine did do it for me some too, of course. But this was real, right? I'm like, this is something that people could actually do. They could like build a boat and go across the wilds of the Pacific, right? So what is this story, right? What is Kon-Tiki? So this takes place, honestly, in 1947. And it's the brainchild of this guy, Thor Heyerdahl. Now, my last several podcasts, I talked about how people with terrible names like Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, they're forced to become pseudo-archaeologists, because their name, they can't do anything else. What about their name? I have to say this bucks my trend a little because the name Thor Heyerdahl. I mean, dude, that's an awesome name. What can you do? That might be the best name there ever was. Might be number one. So this guy, just to give you his dates, he was born in 1914 and he dies in, I think, 2002. Lives a long life. A lot of these explorer guys tend to, if they don't get killed, it's at some point they're vaguely healthy individuals. Thor growing up was really excited in the whole sort of adventuring around the world, the finding treasure, right? That sort of adventuresome spirit. And so in his 30s, and this is right after World War II, right? This is a different world for everyone. This is World War II ends in 1945. And I think its timing was part of its success. Now, I don't mean success so much in what it actually did. We'll get to that in a minute. I mean in terms of its publicity. The Kon-Tiki voyage was huge in terms of publicity. And that's why if this happens in 1947, 56, so it's like 30 years later, why I'm still going to read a little scholastic book on it, right? So what Thor Heyerdahl does is he thinks that Polynesia, the islands of the Pacific, were populated by people coming from Peru, right? So this is from South America and going west across the Pacific. So he's going to, quote unquote, prove this by building a, quote unquote, native raft and then sailing it across, right? It's a fairly crazy idea. We got to say that, but he does it. And what he does is it's made out of balsa, basically. It's like a big old raft. Now, I will link down below I'll link to the Wikipedia page because I think later I'll read some quotes off it because they have some pretty funny quotes on there. But it's really good about some of its photos and stuff. And you can Google Kon-Tiki. It'll come up in a minute. The name Kon-Tiki is for the boat. And Thor Heyerdahl had some backstory to the name, like it had to do with the Inca or something. It makes no sense. And what we're going to see is, unfortunately, Thor Heyerdahl, while being very into the exploration side of things, he doesn't really do his homework, right? He just gets these crazy ideas and then seeks to prove them. But then all he really does is prove a crazy idea. He doesn't prove anything about history or what actually happened. So builds this boat and then goes on this voyage with several other people. He's not alone. The boat is really weird because he says he makes it off of notes from the Spanish conquistadors or something. But honestly, it's just this weird pastiche of sort of native-esque, is it nativist? It reminds me of the idea that I talked about in previous podcast, Mayanism. The idea where the ancient Maya, it sort of gets this new age thing with it, right? It's very new age and has nothing to do with facts. So he builds this boat out of balsa, kind of straps it together. And again, it's this combo. It's odd. It's like a raft. It almost looks like some Huckleberry Finn raft, but like much bigger. But then he has masts on it and stuff. Again, a pastiche of modern technology and pseudo old technology. It's just a weird thing. But they set off on their journey. Takes them 101 days. I believe it's like 4,300 miles or something like this. And they finally do get to an island in the Pacific. So he does show you that you can take a funky, weird pastiche boat and make it to an island from South America across the Pacific into a real island in Polynesia. Now, this becomes just a huge smash pop culture event, so much so that they put out a documentary in 1950 on the voyage of the Kon-Tiki, and it wins the Academy Award, I believe, for Best Documentary in 1951. So it's just huge. Thor Heyerdahl also becomes a member of the Explorers Club, and he's not the only member of the Explorers Club. Okay, I'm a member of the Explorers Club. And when we come back, what does that mean?
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By honoring your sacred vocation of education, you impact your family, your friends, and your community. At Grand Canyon University, our online bachelor's, master's, and doctoral education degree programs allow you to balance online coursework with observational and hands-on experience in the field. Find your purpose at GCU. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
Hello, and welcome back to the Pseudo Archaeology Podcast, episode 131. And I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kinkella, member of the Explorers Club. And we have been discussing the story of Kon-Tiki. Now, as you saw in the first segment, the story of Kon-Tiki is pretty straightforward. Crazily driven explorer Thor Heyerdahl makes funky boat out of balsa and sails it willy-nilly across the Pacific and makes it to a Polynesian island. Right. And becomes quite a bit of a celebrity in the late 1940s and the 1950s. Now, Thor Heyerdahl after this does do a couple other funky expeditions like that, always with the same sort of spacey ideas. He does like a Easter Island thing later in the 1950s. He builds a couple more boats. I remember like the Ra and the Ra 2 that were supposedly, I believe, to sail from Africa to the New World, I believe. Don't quote me on it. But, the reason why I believe the Ra 2 had to be made was the Ra 1 basically started to sink. And he did one other one with a boat, I believe, called the Tigris, where he did some stuff around Mesopotamia. So always with this idea of exploration, but again, with no scientific or historical deep knowledge. So that part is a bit of a bummer. And the downside of Thor Heyerdahl, now he makes a great character, this explorer's explorer, great name. The downside, though, is his unscientific, again, not thought out plans were basically to prove first that Polynesia, and I mean all the islands of Polynesia, were basically colonized in the ancient past by people from South America, but that these people were white. It's just odd. Now, I might be getting bits and bobs of this wrong because honestly, I confuse them sometimes because he has a couple of different expeditions and they're all the same. But here, I'll quote the Wikipedia entry, which I really like. Wikipedia says the basis of the Kon-Tiki expedition was pseudoscientific, radically controversial, and has not gained acceptance among scientists, even prior to the voyage. That's pretty bad. Heyerdahl believed that the original inhabitants of Easter Island were the Tiki people, a race of white-bearded men who supposedly originally sailed from Peru. He described these Tiki people as being sun-worshipping, fair-skinned people with blue eyes, fair or red hair, tall statues, and beards. And these people were originally from the Middle East and had crossed the Atlantic earlier, right? So once you hear this, which is very silly and sort of that has that pseudo-ignorant racist thing, it's so sad. It's so unfortunate. But then all his other voyages make sense because he's trying to show that everything kind of comes from the Middle East and goes westward, right? It goes across the Atlantic and then to the New World and then out into the Pacific Islands. It's just really too bad. It really ends up where there's this kind of fun explorers vibe thing, that is kind of dirtied by some really stupid ideas, even for the time, right? I'm not here to apply the ethos of 2023 to somebody who's doing something in 1947, but I am here to apply the ethos of 1947 to somebody who's doing something in 1947. And even then, come on, we all know, especially me, because I have like a big PhD, dude. So everything I say is right. That in terms of anthropology and in terms of the understanding of peoples of the world, even in 1947, we knew that idea was like preposterous and stupid. So it's just really too bad. Now, with that said, he was a member of the Explorers Club. And I really enjoy the Explorers Club. So the Explorers Club is kind of this old school group, and it really is an international club, right, of people who explore stuff, and while you have stories like this where the ideology behind it is obviously just foolish as hell, like the Explorers Club can do good stuff too. The Explorers Club basically supports certain explorations, and we'll give money and support to groups if they apply for it, just like any place else. So I've seen very good projects run for the Explorers Club, but this is that ideology of exploration. Thor Heyerdahl is a great example of adventure for adventure's sake with no academic thought behind it, right? So it's so sad because with the Kon-Tiki, that could have been a time to do some really great experimental archaeology. And what experimental archaeology is, right, is you like rebuild something from the past and try it out and see if it works. I love experimental archaeology. But the Kon-Tiki is so weird that it's not experimental archaeology because it's not based on anything historic, right? It's just an oddity. So as we find so often on this show, I'm thinking back, like way back to some of my episodes, like on The Thing. You get these eccentric people who have these little odd adventures or make these odd things, and they gain popularity just because they're so odd and in left field. And I think the Kon-Tiki totally fits with that. And also, I think the Kon-Tiki kind of, because it comes out in the late 1940s, early 50s, it rides that wave of like sort of Polynesian kitschiness, of the 1950s, like the Tiki Room, that sort of that 50s, sort of bamboo looking, vaguely Polynesian, right? You have your Polynesian themed party in that time. If you're watching something like Mad Men, the show Mad Men, you could see them doing that, having like a Polynesian theme. that's sort of like this kitschy pastiche of Polynesian culture that doesn't really stand for much of anything. So ultimately, what gives his project a big boost is really that he's in the right place at the right time. And he has that explorer's vibe and look. When we return, some final ideas on Thor Heyerdahl on the Kon-Tiki, and some ideas that might have been at slightly the wrong time, but were really good. Hello, and welcome back to the Pseudo-Archaeology Podcast, episode 131. I'm your host, one last time, Dr. Andrew Kinkella, and we have been discussing the Kon-Tiki and Thor Heyerdahl, and it's we'll move on towards the sort of long-term effects. What does it mean now? But before we get there, I teased you at the end of the last segment with a tease, because that's how I like keep you listening. You know, I know how to do this, and I was like, hey, sometimes there's some great ideas that might not have the same luck in terms of like cultural timing, right? So the Kon-Tiki, this silly, funky boat, that basically sunk right by the end. I think they hit a reef right at the end, and then, but it, they had problems. They basically, the boat just basically drifted. That's what the Kon-Tiki did. The Kon-Tiki, it had like a sail, but it just sort of followed the prevailing winds and that kind of thing. And that was one of Thor Heyerdahl's points is look, I can just basically set this thing adrift and it'll hit something out in the Pacific. On the flip side, about 25 years after Kon-Tiki, a little bit more, 28 or something like this, the Polynesian Voyaging Society in Hawaii built a double-hulled canoe called the Hokulea. And this thing, man, is badass. And I think what's so sad is we all have heard the term Kon-Tiki, but we have not heard the name Hokulea, right? The Hokulea is not launched in 1975. And this is like a culturally correct double-hulled canoe of that Polynesian style, right? Correct. Now, and this, before I even get to what it did, this can be a really great experimental archaeology moment here, right? Where we're trying a real boat made to real specifications and seeing how it does. And guess what? The Hokulea went from Hawaii to Tahiti using only traditional navigation, right? Just only using the stars and that sort of thing. Traditional navigation techniques. That's amazing. Good for them. They didn't get to start at a big ass continent like Kon-Tiki. They went island to island, right? Thousands of miles away. Hawaii to Tahiti. That's forever and a day gone. That is an amazing voyage. So good for them, right? And they tried to do it in the style, in sort of what we were, you could say like sort of the ancient style or the cultural style. Whereas Kon-Tiki, of course, had like radios on it and sextants, and they had technology on it to figure out where they were. The Hokulea didn't. And what I will say too is that the Hokulea started its initial voyage from Honolulu Bay. Honolulu Bay is in Maui. I've been to Honolulu Bay, and Honolulu Bay, you guys, is beautiful. It's on the the northwest corner, the far northwest corner of Maui, way up top in the corner. And that bay, like, it is just note to self, if you're ever on Maui, it is some of the best snorkeling over there. The parking, you just sort of have to park on the side of the road. It's one of those. You even have to walk across. It's like this little tiny strip of jungle. All of a sudden you're in the jungle for a moment. There's a little tiny little creek there. You walk through it. You bring your backpack with your snorkeling stuff in it. It's kind of rocky. There's no real beach there. But then you get out there and the snorkeling is fantastic. I highly recommend Honolulu Bay for snorkeling. Now that's in the summer. In the winter, that's some of the biggest big wave surfing in Hawaii is in that area. But anyway, I just thought it was really interesting reading that. I'm like, wow, they took off from Honolulu Bay. Oh, what a pretty place. And then after the Hokulea did its voyage to Tahiti, it wasn't on the verge of crapping out like the Kon-Tiki. It did 9 additional voyages, right? They went to like Micronesia, they're just showing off Polynesia, Japan, went over to the United States just for the hell of it. Like that. Oh, dude, good for you. Right. And in a lot of ways, it was also sort of done to show the middle finger to the Kon-Tiki. And I think it did a great job. But the bummer is you just hear again and again and again about Thor Heyerdahl and Kon-Tiki. And we should be hearing more about the Hokulea just because, dude, what a great story. Right. So at least there's that. So as we kind of wind down, and we kind of have this wider look at Thor Heyerdahl, what can we say about this? These are in a way, some of my favorite conversations because we're totally in a gray area, because if you look at somebody like Thor Heyerdahl, his ideas on how Polynesia was populated are utterly racist and disproven and a pointless waste of time, right? That the people of Easter Island were blonde haired or whatever. It's just ludicrous. Like, we're grown-ups, man. What the hell? So you got that. But we have to analyze him with a cold scientific mind. We would say on the other side, the Kon-Tiki voyage does sell like that sense of wonder, right? That sense of excitement. Some of that, sometimes I do see missing a bit in modern archaeology. I find that a lot of times modern archaeologists they try and be too cool. They try and be too cool for school. They're like, well, archaeology, it's a lot of work. It's not really that exciting. And I hear that again and again. And I think that academics are really shooting themselves in the foot, because what's sad is real academic archaeology does have the best answers to the past, right? It does have the data and the knowledge. You can tell the very best, the most accurate story of the past using real archaeology. But then to sell it to the public like, yeah, but it's boring. And that's not the public saying that. That's actual archaeologists, because they think that saying somehow that their work is exciting takes away, cheapens it or something. And I am here to say, friends, we must stop that, because then you have pseudoscientists like Thor Heyerdahl who are going to take the public's imagination away because we're not filling it. So you know what I'm going to do? You know what, friends? My research, it's exciting as hell. I work on the ancient Maya. I work in the cenotes. Yeah, that's right. I swashbuckle through the jungle with a backpack and a canteen. I spend the night in the middle of the jungle. I can hear jaguars. I go diving to 100 feet in the middle of the jungle. Is it super exciting? Yeah, it's as exciting as it sounds. And my story is not alone. Other archaeologists have stories just like mine. So my little note here to other archaeologists is please, please, please brag about yourselves. And with that, I'll talk to you guys next time. Thanks for listening to the Pseudo Archaeology Podcast. Please like and subscribe wherever you like and subscribe. And if you have questions for me, Dr. Andrew Kinkella, feel free to reach out using the links below or go to my YouTube channel, Kinkella Teaches Archaeology. See you guys next time.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.